I am so thrilled to be speaking today with Amitav Ghosh, who is absolutely a personal literary hero. So this is really, really exciting for me. A little about Amitav Ghosh. He was born in Calcutta and grew up in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. He studied in Delhi, Oxford, and Alexandria. He is the author of many acclaimed works of nonfiction and fiction, most recent of which is the novel Gun Island. He's received numerous accolades. I'm just going to list a few. His novel, The Circle of Reason, was awarded France's Prix Medici Award in 1990. The Shadowlines won 2 prestigious Indian prizes the same year, including the Ananda Puraskar. The Calcutta Chromosome won the Arthur C. Clarke Award in 1997, and The Glass Palace won the International eBook Award at the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2001, and so on and so forth.
I'm very glad to be with you, Kartika, and thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this. There's such extraordinary stuff going on all around us,
Yes.
The wildfires in California, the Atlantic hurricanes. It's
yes,
just unbelievable.
It really is, truly. And we'll be talking about that a little bit today, most likely. I wanted to get started by asking you about the modern novel. More specifically, in The Great Derangement, you describe how the modern novel privileges a kind of narrative pleasure compatible with what you call a new regularity of bourgeois life. Placid narratives, fillers that offer calm passions, quite unlike the phenomena you were just speaking about. You discuss how the realistic fiction of today is also bound by these very conventions and traditions that, despite seeming really committed to exercising anything extraordinary or unlikely, ironically have the effect of concealing reality. So how does this then shape the way modern literary fiction, realistic fiction portrays, or rather fails to portray, the undeniable and ever-present effects of climate change? Even the Avant-Garde, as the book suggests, has failed to really capture the realness of climate change.
The central thing that happens with literary modernity, which essentially we are speaking about a Western literary modernity, which is variously sort of adapted by people elsewhere. But the central thing about it is that it's completely centered on humans.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most important and the most basic aspect of literary modernity. And it's essentially a phenomenon that emerges in the 18th and 19th century and becomes solidified in the 20th century. So this idea of the human, it's interesting because even though it's in the 18th century that we get the idea of human beings as a species, as Homo sapiens as a species, though there was a long fight about that amongst Western scientists, because some felt that the human species had multiple geneses. Some Darwin took the position that it had a single genesis, and so on. So there was an interesting sort of debate about that. But the guy who actually names the human species as Homo sapiens is Linnaeus, who invents the Linnaean system of nomenclature for science and so on. But even though he gives the human species a single name, he immediately qualifies that by saying that there are many kinds of humans, some of whom are in the tropics, some of whom are in Africa, etc. So it's very interesting to think that, when this idea of putting humans at the center of literature, the time that it arises, it's really not about all humans. It's basically about Western humans.
Yes.
That's the fundamental thrust of it. It's about the West, and it's about the supreme centrality of Western humanity is really what it is. So it's not just that it excludes other kinds of beings. It's also that it excludes really most of the species that we now call humanity. This doesn't change under avant-gardism. It doesn't change under European, post-1945 avant-gardism. In fact, if anything, literature, especially Western literature, comes to be more Western, more centered upon, the Western human, and in a way, if you look at the sort of experimentalism of that kind of avant-gardism, it results in a kind of absolute withdrawal into the human, into these abstractions, uh, a complete disengagement from the world around us, and a complete disengagement from other beings. I mean, if Herman Melville's, there are many exceptions to this, of course, but Melville's Moby Dick is about other beings. It's about humans in relation to other beings. But can you imagine a novel like Moby Dick being written in the late 20th century? If it had been written, it would have been regarded as a fantasy or children's fiction or something like that.
Absolutely, that's so true. I was thinking the other day about how Melville's work definitely wouldn't have made it through the average creative writing workshop at a graduate level. Would definitely have been called fantastical or genre, perhaps. And that's true. As I've been considering our conversation and your work, I've been thinking of Debjani Bhattacharya's book that discusses so much of these divides, these artificial binaries. I'm also thinking about Robin Kimmerer, who talks about the privilege of animacy. And she says how English, the language, reserves the pronouns of personhood for humans and not for non-human animals, plants, and landscapes, which are just not given the privilege of animacy through English. But many of North America's indigenous languages, of course, were free from these barriers, and with them free from that vast rift that you've been talking about, that we perceive between human and non-human, and then who gets to be human, which humans get to be human as well. But I see that a great deal in your fiction, how from your early works, how the environment and non-human animals aren't merely background, something to be discovered or tamed. Further, they're participants, they drive the narrative, they have agency, they're characters, they're protagonists. And, you've been breaking down those borders and those categories of the imaginary really for so many years. So when did you start to shift away from what you call the deification of the human that makes us feel so divorced from all other life and phenomena? How did you start to do this?
Well, I don't know that I can give a very coherent account of that. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm Bengali. I'm from Bengal. And a lot of my writing has been about Bengal and the surrounding regions. And this has a very important bearing on what we're talking about, really, because, Bengal is incredibly vulnerable to climate change. Really, I became aware of these environmental issues really when I started spending a lot of time in the Sundarbans, starting in 2000, when I began researching my novel, The Hungry Tide. Already then you could see the sort of incredible impacts that climate change was having in this region. So from then on, I've worked on other things, I've thought about other sorts of issues, but the whole issue of climate change and the question of climate change has never been far from my mind. And it's exactly this. When you engage with the world, when you engage with the life around you, it opens you up in certain ways. And certainly, being in the Sundarban, talking to the people who live there, they live with other beings. For them, the tiger is a being, with emotions, with agency. The same is true of many other kinds of animals. The same is true of the weather, So all of these things, I think, have gone into it, making me look elsewhere, if you like, than the sort of modernist tradition.
glad you mentioned the Sundarbans, because I've been, you know, in the hungry tide. I remember reading about them, and I was just completely blown away. And I remember we experienced that storm that just obliterates categories, right? And it obliterates like the stories and ideologies and the trappings of the colonial, the traditional, the modern, the scientific, and all the characters, including the non-human ones, are just brought into this intimacy and recognition. And now again in Gun Island, we would return to the Sundarbans, and clearly to you, they aren't merely a setting, they aren't merely a stage to place characters, a plot, like so many times in fiction there. You don't do that at all, especially considering how vulnerable this place is, how many like you were saying, coalescing crises are unfolding there so fast. How visible and dangerous we can see climate changes there. Were you compelled to return to writing about the Sundarbans? Were you just, was it irresistible? How did you return to Pia and the Sundarbans in Gun Island, I guess, is my winding question.
Yes, I felt really compelled to return to the Sundarban. The Sundarban is an incredibly powerful landscape. You know, it's a landscape which has its own agency. You can literally see the land changing around you from day to day. You know, it's a very powerful landscape to interact with, and it literally just thrust itself back upon me and into my book. You know. Most of all, because the sort of upheaval that we are seeing in the Sundarban now, you know, it's not just environmental, it's sociological. It's I mean, so for instance, you know, because of these climate impacts, there's been a huge outflow of migrants from the Sundarban. Very large numbers of people have lost their livelihoods. So even though India has gotten better at predicting cyclones, because you know that's a worldwide scientific phenomenon. So even though the loss of life is nowadays not as great as it used to be in the past during a cyclone, you know, a cyclone that hit the Sundarban in 1970 was the worst natural disaster of the 20th century. It killed up to 500,000 people. But nowadays, you know, there's nothing like that. There's no death toll like that. But what cyclones have done is that they've taken an incredible toll in livelihoods. So people lose their way, you know, their sustenance. Their land gets inundated with salt water, so they can't grow any more crops on it. And they just, you know, the embankments break, so water floods their villages, and there's no stopping it. So millions have left, and where have they gone? They've gone to Delhi, and they've gone to the West Coast, which is comparatively more prosperous. But you know, we see these multiple crises interacting with each other in these disastrous ways now. For example, during the COVID pandemic, as you know, because of governmental policy, there was this incredibly harsh lockdown, which nobody seems to have thought or considered the fate of the migrant workers. You know, so the migrant workers found themselves stranded in these cities, and finally they became so desperate they started walking home, and there were a lot of them walking home towards Bengal. Mm-hmm. And what should happen right then? But a cyclone started up in the Bay of Bengal, a cyclone called Cyclone Amphan. And a lot of these workers who were walking home suddenly found themselves confronted with these multiple kinds of crises. So really, you know, what we are seeing is just all these interacting catastrophes now producing these absolute disasters.
The last thing I read was that there's no official count of the death toll of migrant workers, which is horrifying.
Completely horrifying. I mean, you know, the COVID pandemic, like climate change, has interacted with inequalities in very disastrous ways. We've seen that in the US, for example.
Yes.
But really in India, it just became just all-out class war.
Yes.
That's what it was, you know.
We've been talking about how the existing conventions of the modern novel make it such an act of rebellion, experimentation, and disobedience to write about climate change in its complexity, in, like you're saying, all these intersecting, interconnected disasters and catastrophes that are such a daily part of life. I'm also thinking about other ways in which the imagination, the collective perception of safety, community, and danger can be eroded away. In The Great Derangement, you describe how now we've all kind of subscribed to that colonial vision of the world in which the closer you are to water, the more power and security, kind of the idea of conquest, it means that you have. And now that's just a part of middle class living. And of course, you really insightfully point out that cities like Mumbai, Chennai, New York, they were all brought into being by the process of colonization. And now they're some of the cities most threatened by climate change. And so sort of the stilted settings of novels and the brazenness of those surveyors when planning these cities close to the water, both are tied to the idea of discontinuities, and part of what even news cycles, right, give us these isolated, small, tidy packets of information that fail to grasp how vast and connected these problems are. And I'm wondering how we might, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how we might start to subvert, rebel, disobey, or at least retrain ourselves against this, well, first that colonial grasp and then the modern novels grasp on our imagination, especially as fiction writers and readers. How can we start to free ourselves from this grasp and incorporate realities like climate change into fiction? How do we start to do that?
That kind of rebellion has, in fact, already started. I think especially since 2018, there's been a sea change in the literary world. More and more writers are writing about these issues, especially the many younger writers are writing about these issues. More and more people are aware of this, even within the literary world. When I began writing The Great Derangement, it's strange to think it's just 5 years ago, 2015. When I would tell my writer friends that I'm writing something about climate change and literature and history and so on, they would kind of look astonished and say, why, what's with that? Why are you writing about those things? What does that have to do with literature? And, now I don't think anybody would say that. It's just taken 5 years for everyone to see, the disaster, the catastrophe that we're in the midst of. And especially since 2018, I think there has been a sort of real stir, and and many writers groups have now started. I think the best one is this Extinction Rebellion, XR Rebel, Writers Rebel. There's a chapter in New York, there's a chapter in London. The London chapter is particularly sort of active. So yeah, I think there has been really a kind of massive reaction against the earlier indifference, that we saw. Now, the question of, what kinds of stories are we going to tell? I don't think that I or anyone else can dictate to the world what stories you tell. It just doesn't work like that, You can't sit, my climate scientist friends sometimes says, oh, you must help tell the story. And I think that, it doesn't work like that. I can't be out there doing propaganda on behalf of some particular worldview. It's just that you open your eyes to seeing what the reality is. Don't artificially exclude this reality, which is actually what happens a lot of the time. But then again, there are many writers who, without thinking explicitly about the issues that we are talking about, do let it enter their fiction. Jesmyn Ward is a good example. That wonderful book she wrote about that was set in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. So there are many examples of that kind of writing. But you also also made a good point early on, which is that indigenous peoples, I think, around the world, but most sort of visibly in the Americas, have always had a very powerful sense of the life of other beings, and of the land itself. I mean, we see this repeatedly coming up, I mean, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, indigenous people constantly repeating the thing that the land is alive. There's a wonderful instance of an indigenous chief in Oregon who refused to sign one of those treaties because he said the land is excluded from this treaty. The land is not speaking. So I think in those ways there are all these other kinds of stories that can be told, and really, contemporary indigenous writers have been doing that.
Yes.
If we think of Leslie Marmon Silko, for example, and so many other, brilliant young indigenous writers. And it's a really remarkable thing, that they've preserved this sense of the vitality of the land and other beings, despite every attempt over 300 years to stamp it out.
Right.
I mean, just with the most extreme kinds of violence,
Right.
So I think, we have to pay attention to these other ways of telling stories. In Bengali, we have these river novels. There's the great Oriya writer Gopinath Mohanty, who wrote about forests and so on, and Shivarama Karanth in Kannada. In Bengali, we had Mahashweta Devi. We had so many great writers. But there again, one of the problems is that Western style modernism, avant-gardism, has changed that. I mean, amongst the younger writers, very few, as far as I can see, are actually writing about rural India,
right,
or about the sorts of themes that Indian literature was really strong at.
I'm also thinking about writers, contemporary writers perhaps, who do address climate, like cli-fi, climate fiction, full of these doomsday futures and just like gleeful apocalyptic terror, right? Just and you seem also to be resisting that, because Gun Island is a surprisingly quite a hopeful book towards the end, and which is so lovely, which is wonderful. So what were you hoping to move towards, and what were you resisting in infusing it with that hope as we're seeing catastrophe?
I've always resisted this apocalyptic fiction. I think that's very much a Western, and you might even say a Western male gaze upon the world. This embracing of apocalypse. I've always felt that, coming from the part of the world that I am from, I almost feel that I have a responsibility not to wish doom upon my fellow beings. So I've always resisted that, and at considerable cost, I might say. With a couple of my books, they seem to ask almost for an apocalyptic ending, but I just couldn't bring myself to do that, and I still cannot. When a writer writes about some sort of cli-fi thing about the world eaten up by apocalypse, but a few people manage to escape. What is that? Really, it's a kind of genocidal imagining, isn't it?
Yes.
That's what it really is. It's a sort of genocidal imagination. And unfortunately, what underlies it is actually a genocidal imagination.
Yes.
When people say that, when someone, for example, buys a retreat in New Zealand, what does it really mean? It means that he's going to get out and everyone else can perish.
Yes.
Or when a billionaire says, they want to colonize Mars.
Right.
What are they really saying? That everybody on this earth can, they can dig their own graves and die. So these are actually genocidal imaginings. And there's a very long tradition of this in Western literature and in Western modernism. I mean, and some would say that it goes back to, apocalyptic Christian cults and so on. But, I think I find that way of approaching the world really deeply problematic.
Yes. We've talked a lot today about ways in which people are dissenting and pushing back, and how there's a tradition of that as well, especially in South Asian literature and indigenous literature across the world. I've been thinking about how you've done this, not just with your writing, not just with your fiction, but also with your voice and your actions. For instance, you withdrew your novel, The Glass Palace, from the Commonwealth Prize in 2001, which from a contest you didn't know that the publishers had entered it into. And of course, you did this with a lot of grace, asserting that there was no disrespect to the competition's judges, of course, or previous winners, that you admired them greatly. But you talked about how the term itself, the idea of a Commonwealth literature, went against what the book was itself critiquing. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about that briefly.
Well, The Glass Palace is really, a lot of it is about anti-colonial rebellion. And I spent a lot of time interviewing people who were involved in these rebellions. And I did feel that, I would be kind of betraying them in some sense in accepting a prize which is actually celebrating the legacy of empire, quite explicitly celebrating that legacy of empire by restricting the prize only to work written in English. Mm-hmm. And, I must say, though, that whole experience has really been an amazing experience, because I've been in touch with the Commonwealth Foundation quite a lot in these last few years. Subsequent to my letter and my withdrawal, they actually changed the whole prize. They changed the parameters of the prize. Now they included other languages. They've opened it up to writers who write in a variety of languages. So this is one of those rare occasions, when some sort of gesture actually makes things better.
Yes.
So I have to say, I really congratulate the Commonwealth Foundation for taking, a self-critical view.
Right.
And I feel very glad that I did this.
Who are some of the South Asian writers, thinkers, and activists who we should be paying attention to? If there are some ways of writing and creating that you're seeing right now that are capturing our extraordinary reality. And of course, you don't have to limit yourself to South Asian writers, but...
Oh, there are so many writers around the world who are writing really interesting stuff, in response to the world we see around us. I'm not going to name specific names because what happens, I'll forget someone. What I will say is that I do feel that it is the case that hybrid forms are emerging. And this is something we see very much in South Asia. I don't know if you know the work of the artist Sarnath Banerjee. He wrote a wonderful graphic novel about water in Delhi. It's a really striking piece of work. So there are many different kinds of hybrid work coming out. I should mention in this context that I myself have adapted the legend of the Sundarbans. This is the story of Bon Bibi. I've adapted it in verse, which is a first for me. And it's a part of it was in The Hungry Tide, but this is I've adapted a whole sort of long episode from this legend. It's called Jungle Nama, and it will be published, early next year. It was meant to be published this year, but it didn't. It wasn't possible. Again, I've tried to work in a hybrid way. So I've been working with a South Asian artist, an American South Asian origin American artist called Salman Toor. And, so it's going to be images and text working together, in the ways of in the manner of an illuminated manuscript. Wow. most of these stories and so on were written as illuminated manuscripts in the past. So I'm trying to return to that, the sort of joining of image and text.
Yes.
Because I think one of the real problems also, with modernism, with again, I'll say even with the avant-garde,
Yes.
is the absolute logocentrism, the absolute expulsion of images from all serious discourse, and it was a really infectious thing. When I was a child, we would be punished if we were caught reading comic books, because it was thought that images sort of stunt your ability to think. Can you imagine? I mean, the idiocy of it.
Right.
And I think it still exists. I mean, if you look at the early Victorian novelists, through the 19th century, most novels had some pictures in them.
Yes.
Charles Dickens had, his books had pictures in them, Jane Austen, Melville, whoever you like. But by the turn of the century, by the turn of the early 20th century, images became taboo within novels. I mean, you can't imagine James Joyce having images in his books, all of that became completely taboo. And I think it's time for us to really break with that, and to go back to working with these hybrid forms. So this text, Jungle Nama, it'll have many iterations, which is another thing that used to happen with texts before. They had many different iterations, so they would exist as a play, sometimes as a film, in pictorial forms of various kinds. So I'm also going to work with a graphic artist to do a graphic novel of it, and also to maybe make a game.
That sounds like so much fun. Was it fun? Was it different? Did it challenge you in different ways? That sounds so exciting.
It was incredibly challenging. Because I should mention that, I adapted Jungle Nama in a Bengali verse meter. In Bengali, it's known as Dvipadi Poyar, but I adapted that verse meter into English, so using the same metrical structure. This was something that was inspired by my dear friend Agha Shahid Ali, who adapted ghazals into English. So it was a really interesting way to do it, because most of our texts were not meant to be read silently. I mean, silent reading really didn't exist until the 18th century, and people read aloud. So that's what rhythm and meter helped. It helped people read things out aloud.
Right.
So I've adapted it in that meter, and I'm hoping that people will read this aloud.
Yes.
So yes, it sounds kind of wrong at a time of such a terrible crisis everywhere, to say that one enjoyed doing anything really. But yeah, it was incredibly exciting. It was exhilarating. I finished it just at like about 3 weeks into the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful to have that.
No, that sounds great. And I'm so glad you did enjoy it.